Arizona Territory, 1882. The merciless sun beat down on the dusty town of Rattlesnake Ridge where water was scarce and mercy scarcer still. The desert had a way of stripping men to their bones, revealing what they truly were beneath the veneer of civilization. For Caleb Crawford, the desert had become both sanctuary and prison, a place where he could outrun his past but never escape the loneliness that followed him like a shadow. At 25, Caleb had the weathered eyes of a much older man, though his handsome features remained unmarred by the harshness of frontier life. Tall and lean with broad shoulders from years of ranch work, his light brown hair was usually hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat that shielded his face from the relentless sun. Despite his youthful appearance with only a hint of stubble lining his jaw, there was something guarded in his blue eyes, something that kept people at a distance. That was exactly how Caleb preferred it. The frontier was no place for softness or sentiment. Out here, attachment was a liability that could get a man killed. He'd learned that lesson 3 years ago when his older brother died in his arms after a botched cattle raid, bleeding out beneath the indifferent Arizona stars while Caleb could do nothing but watch. Since that day, he'd built walls higher than the mesas that dotted the landscape, convinced that survival meant standing alone. "Another," Caleb said, pushing his empty whiskey glass toward Sam, the barkeep at the Dusty Trail Saloon. It was barely past noon, but the saloon was already half full with cowboys, miners, and drifters seeking respite from the heat. Sam raised an eyebrow but poured the drink. "Awful early, ain't it, Crawford?" "Even for you." Caleb didn't respond, just tossed back the whiskey and felt it burn all the way down. He had plans to sign on with a cattle drive heading north to Colorado the following day, good, honest work that would keep him moving, keep him from putting down roots. That was his pattern: work hard, save money, then move on before anyone got close enough to matter, before he started caring about anything he might lose. The saloon doors swung open, flooding the dim interior with harsh sunlight. Caleb squinted against the glare, barely registering the slim figure that stepped inside until the whispers started rippling through the room. "Who is that?" a miner at the next table muttered. "Must be Catherine Lambert's daughter," another replied. "Heard she was coming back from that fancy school back east." Curiosity got the better of Caleb, and he turned on his stool. The woman who stood in the doorway seemed as out of place in Rattlesnake Ridge as a rose in a cactus patch. She was young, no more than 21 or 22, with honey blonde hair pulled back in a practical but becoming style. Her traveling dress was modest but clearly of Eastern quality, the blue fabric complementing eyes that, even from across the room, Caleb could see were the color of the sky just before dusk. She carried herself with a quiet dignity that immediately set her apart from the few other women in town. "Miss Lambert," Sam called out, surprise evident in his voice. "Welcome back to Rattlesnake Ridge." The young woman smiled, a genuine smile that transformed her already beautiful face into something that made Caleb's chest tighten unexpectedly. "Thank you, Mr. Holloway," she replied, her voice clear and confident. "I was hoping you could direct me to my father's ranch. The stagecoach driver mentioned it was several miles outside of town, but I'm afraid I'm not familiar with the area anymore." Caleb snorted quietly to himself. Another Eastern lady playing at frontier life. She'd be heading back to civilization within a week when she discovered just how harsh reality was out here. Sam looked uncomfortable. "Miss Lambert, I'm sorry to be the bearer of bad news, but your father, there was an accident at the mine 3 weeks back. He didn't make it." The color drained from the young woman's face, but she didn't collapse or dissolve into hysterics as Caleb might have expected. Instead, she gripped the edge of the bar, steadied herself, and after a moment asked in a slightly shakier voice, "And the ranch?" "Still there," Sam said. "Your father's foreman, Pete Johnson, has been keeping things running, waiting on word from you." She nodded slowly, processing this information. "I see, then I'll need to hire a guide to take me there immediately." Several men in the saloon perked up at this opportunity, but before any could volunteer, the doors burst open again. This time, 5 rough-looking riders stormed in, spurs jingling against the wooden floor. Their leader, a tall man with a scarred face and cold eyes, scanned the room before his gaze landed on the young woman. "Well, well," he drawled, removing his hat with mocking politeness. "If it isn't Catherine Lambert's little girl, returned just in time to sell us that prime water rights property, I see." The woman straightened her spine. Mr. Vickers. I wasn't aware my father was considering selling the ranch. The man, Vickers, smiled without warmth. He wasn't, but now that he's gone and you're here all alone, I figured you'd be sensible enough to take a fair offer before heading back east where you belong. I have no intention of selling, she replied evenly. Vickers stepped closer, looming over her. That's so, pretty young thing like you has no business trying to run a struggling cattle operation, especially when water's getting scarce and accidents happen so easily out here. The threat hung in the air, unmistakable. Caleb watched the exchange with growing unease. This was exactly the kind of entanglement he avoided, other people's problems that had nothing to do with him. He should finish his drink and walk away. The cattle drive would be leaving at dawn, and he needed to prepare. Yet something about the woman's quiet dignity in the face of intimidation held him in place. There was steel beneath that refined exterior, a determination that reminded him painfully of his brother. I believe the lady said she's not selling, Caleb found himself saying, pushing away from the bar and stepping forward. All eyes in the saloon turned to him. Vickers' hand drifted toward his holstered pistol. This isn't your concern, Cowboy. It is now. The words came out before Caleb could stop them. What was he doing? This wasn't his fight. He had a rule about not getting involved, about keeping to himself. Vickers studied him for a long moment, then smiled unpleasantly. Crawford, isn't it? Heard you were riding out with the Palmer outfit tomorrow. Be a shame if something happened to change those plans. I can make my own decisions, Caleb replied, matching Vickers' gaze steadily. The tension in the room was palpable until Vickers finally shrugged. Have it your way, for now. He turned back to the woman. Miss Lambert, the offer stands. Think about it before you make a mistake you can't undo. With that, he nodded to his men and they backed out of the saloon, leaving an uneasy silence in their wake. The woman, Miss Lambert, turned to Caleb with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. Thank you for your intervention, Mr. Crawford. Caleb Crawford. He tipped his hat awkwardly, already regretting his impulsive action. And it was nothing. It wasn't nothing to me, she insisted, extending her hand. Catherine Lambert. Caleb hesitated before taking her hand briefly. Her skin was softer than anything he'd touched in years, a stark reminder of just how different their worlds were. Miss Lambert, you'd best find someone to take you to your father's ranch before dark, he said, eager to extricate himself from the situation. The desert isn't forgiving after sunset. Would you consider being that someone, Mr. Crawford? She asked directly. I gather from that exchange that you know how to handle yourself, and I'd be willing to pay handsomely. Caleb shook his head. I'm leaving on a cattle drive tomorrow, signed on weeks ago. I see. She looked disappointed but nodded graciously. Then perhaps you could recommend someone trustworthy. Something in her expression, the combination of determination and vulnerability, made Caleb hesitate. The memory of his brother's final words came back to him unbidden. Don't let this place make you hard all the way through, little brother. He sighed heavily. The drive doesn't leave until dawn. I suppose I could take you to your father's place and still make it back in time. Her face lit up with relief. Thank you, Mr. Crawford, I'm in your debt. Don't thank me yet, he muttered, and we'll need to leave now if we're going to make it before dark. Within the hour, they were riding out of Rattlesnake Ridge, Caleb on his reliable buckskin gelding and Catherine on a gentle mare borrowed from the livery. She rode surprisingly well for an Eastern lady, sitting straight in the saddle rather than perched sideways as he'd expected. The desert stretched before them, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across the rugged landscape. How long has it been since you've been in Arizona territory? Caleb asked after they'd been riding in silence for several miles. 7 years, Catherine replied, adjusting her hat to better shield her face from the sun. Father sent me to live with my aunt in Boston after my mother died. I was 15 then. And now you're back to claim a ranch you know nothing about. She gave him a sharp look. I lived on that ranch for the first 15 years of my life, Mr. Crawford. I may have been away, but I haven't forgotten everything I learned there. After a pause, she added more softly, besides, it's all I have left of my family now. Caleb felt a twinge of shame at his harsh assessment. It won't be easy. Ranching never is, but it's especially hard now with the drought, and Vickers won't give up easily if he wants your land. Why does he want it so badly? Your father's property has natural springs that haven't dried up yet. With water becoming scarce, that makes your land more valuable than gold to cattlemen like Vickers. Catherine nodded thoughtfully. Then I'll have to be careful, but I won't be intimidated into selling what's rightfully mine. They rode on as the landscape shifted from flat desert to rolling hills dotted with saguaro cacti and mesquite. The heat was oppressive, but Catherine didn't complain once, taking small sips from her canteen as Caleb had instructed and keeping pace without difficulty. As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the desert in hues of gold and crimson, Caleb pointed to a distant cluster of buildings nestled in a small valley. That's the Lambert Ranch. Catherine's breath caught audibly. It looks smaller than I remember. Drought's been hard on everyone, Caleb said. Your father might have had to sell off some of the land. They approached the ranch as the last rays of sunlight clung to the western sky. A weathered man in his 50s emerged from the main house, rifle in hand, as they rode into the yard. That's far enough, he called out, then squinted in recognition. Miss Catherine, is that really you? Catherine dismounted quickly. Pete. Yes, it's me. The foreman lowered his rifle, emotion washing over his face. We've been waiting on word ever since your father. Well, I'm mighty glad to see you, though I wish it were under better circumstances. Mr. Holloway at the saloon told me what happened, Catherine said quietly. I'd like to visit his grave tomorrow if you could show me. Pete nodded solemnly. Of course, Miss Catherine. He glanced at Caleb with suspicion. And who's this? Caleb Crawford, she explained. He kindly offered to escort me from town when I arrived today. Caleb tipped his hat. Just passing through. I'll be heading back to town at first light. Pete's expression softened slightly. Well, you're welcome to a hot meal and a bed for the night. Least we can do. The main house was modest but well-maintained, with simple furnishings that spoke of frontier practicality rather than Eastern comfort. Over a dinner of beans, cornbread, and surprisingly tender beef, Pete filled Catherine in on the state of the ranch, 40 head of cattle remaining, 2 working wells that hadn't dried up yet, and 3 ranch hands besides himself who had stayed loyal. Your father was a good man, Pete said, his voice rough with emotion. He treated his men fair, paid on time even when things got tight. These boys stayed on even when the bigger outfits were offering more. What exactly happened to him? Catherine asked, setting down her fork. Pete and Caleb exchanged glances. The official story is that there was a cave-in at one of the silver mines where your father had invested, Pete said carefully. He was inspecting his stake when it happened. Catherine's eyes narrowed. And the unofficial story? Pete hesitated. Your father had been arguing with Vickers about water rights. The day before the accident they had words in town, pretty heated from what I heard. You think Vickers had something to do with my father's death, Catherine stated flatly. I don't know that for certain, Pete cautioned, but it seemed mighty convenient timing, and now Vickers is pressing to buy this place when he showed no interest before. Caleb watched Catherine absorb this information, expecting tears or at least visible distress. Instead, her expression hardened with resolve. I won't let him get away with this, she said quietly. If he had anything to do with my father's death, he'll answer for it. And I certainly won't sell him this land. Miss Catherine, Pete said gently, Vickers is a dangerous man with a lot of hired guns. This isn't Boston. I'm well aware this isn't Boston, she replied with surprising steel in her voice, which is precisely why I can't show weakness. My father built this ranch from nothing. I won't dishonor his memory by surrendering it at the first sign of trouble. Caleb found himself studying her with new respect. There was more to Catherine Lambert than he'd initially assumed, a core of strength beneath the refined exterior that reminded him of the desert itself. Beautiful but unyielding. Later that night, unable to sleep on the spare cot in the bunkhouse, Caleb stepped outside to smoke a cigarette. The desert night was cool and clear, stars scattered like diamonds across the velvet sky. He was startled to find Catherine already sitting on the porch steps, wrapped in a shawl against the night chill. Couldn't sleep? He asked, leaning against the porch post. She shook her head. Too much to think about. After a pause, she added, You're still planning to leave in the morning. Have to, the cattle drive won't wait. Caleb struck a match and lit his cigarette, the brief flare illuminating his features in the darkness. Of course, Catherine gazed out at the desert, silvered by moonlight. I want to thank you again for helping me today. You had no obligation to get involved. Caleb exhaled a stream of smoke, probably shouldn't have. Getting involved usually leads to trouble. Is that why you prefer to keep moving, to avoid getting involved? Her perception unsettled him. The frontier's no place for putting down roots or forming attachments. Better to keep moving, rely on yourself. Catherine turned to look at him directly. That sounds like a lonely way to live, Mr. Crawford. Better lonely than dead, he replied bluntly. Is that what happened? You lost someone. Caleb stiffened, not accustomed to being read so easily. My brother, 3 years ago, cattle raiders caught us off guard. I'm sorry, she said simply, without the pitying tone he'd come to dread. They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the distant yip of coyotes and the soft whisper of the desert wind. What will you do? Caleb finally asked. About the ranch, about Vickers. Catherine sighed. Learn everything I can from Pete, hire more hands if possible, and find out exactly what happened to my father. That last part could be dangerous. Most worthwhile things are, she countered. Caleb couldn't help but smile slightly at her determination. You surprise me, Miss Lambert. I took you for another delicate Eastern lady who'd run back to civilization at the first sign of hardship. Many have made that mistake about me, she said with a hint of amusement. I may have been educated in Boston, Mr. Crawford, but I was born in this desert. There's more of it in my blood than you might think. As they spoke beneath the vast Arizona sky, something shifted imperceptibly between them. A momentary connection, a recognition of kindred spirits despite their different paths. For the first time in years, Caleb felt the walls he'd built around himself waver just slightly. Dawn came too quickly. Caleb saddled his horse as the first pale light crept across the eastern horizon. Catherine was already awake, dressed in practical riding clothes that must have been stored in the house since her departure years ago. You don't have to see me off, Caleb said, tightening his cinch. I wanted to give you this. She held out a folded piece of paper. It's a letter for Mr. Palmer, explaining that you were delayed helping a lady in distress. I doubt he'll hold it against you if you're a few hours late joining the drive. Caleb took the letter, their fingers brushing momentarily. Thoughtful of you. It's the least I could do, Catherine hesitated, then added, when will the drive be finished? 2 months, give or take. We're taking the herd all the way to Denver. She nodded. Well, if you find yourself back in this part of the territory afterward, you'll always have a place to stay at the Lambert Ranch. Caleb mounted his horse, looking down at her standing in the early morning light. Something inside him wanted to accept her invitation to say he'd return, but the cattle drive awaited, and beyond that, the open road that had been his only constant companion these past 3 years. Take care of yourself, Miss Lambert, he said instead, and watch out for Vickers. With a tip of his hat, he turned his horse toward town, trying not to think about honey-blonde hair and eyes the color of twilight, or the strange reluctance he felt to leave the Lambert Ranch behind. The cattle drive was exactly what Caleb had expected, long days of dust and drudgery, watching over stubborn beasts that seemed determined to scatter at every opportunity. The work was hard but mindless, leaving his thoughts free to wander. More often than he cared to admit, they wandered back to Rattlesnake Ridge and to Catherine Lambert. Had she managed to keep the ranch going? Had Vickers made good on his veiled threats? The questions nagged at him as the drive pushed north through the territories. 3 weeks in, they stopped to rest the herd near a small trading post. While the other cowboys sought whiskey and women, Caleb found himself scanning week-old newspapers for any mention of Rattlesnake Ridge. Looking for something specific, Palmer, the trail boss, asked, catching him with a paper in hand. Just checking if there's any news from back home, Caleb replied evasively. Palmer gave him a knowing look. You mean checking if there's news about that pretty blonde who wrote you the letter? Caleb felt his face warm despite himself, just curious about how things turned out. Son, I've been driving cattle for 30 years. Seen a lot of men try to outrun their feelings by joining up. Never works. Palmer clapped him on the shoulder. Whatever you're running from, or whoever you're running to, you might want to ask yourself if this drive is taking you in the right direction. The words stayed with Caleb that night as he took his turn on watch, staring up at the same stars that shone over Arizona. For the first time in years, the thought of moving on to the next job after this one didn't bring its usual comfort. Instead, he found himself wondering what it would be like to return to the same place, to be expected and welcomed. To be waited for, the thought terrified him almost as much as it enticed him. Meanwhile, back in Arizona territory, Catherine Lambert was discovering just how challenging ranch life could be. The days were long and physically demanding, leaving her exhausted each night. Yet there was satisfaction in the work, in learning the business her father had built, in earning the respect of the ranch hands who had initially doubted her resolve. Pete proved an invaluable teacher, patient with her questions and generous with his knowledge. Under his guidance, she learned to manage the ranch books, to assess the health of the cattle, and to make the difficult decisions required of a ranch owner. But Vickers remained a shadow over everything. True to his word, he continued to press his offer to buy the ranch, each time less politely than the last. When Catherine steadfastly refused, strange things began to happen. Fences were cut. A small fire broke out in one of the outbuildings. Cattle went missing. "He's trying to wear you down," Pete warned after they discovered their best breeding bull dead from a gunshot wound that was clearly no accident. "Make running the ranch so difficult that selling seems like the only option." Catherine stared at the dead animal, anger burning through her grief. "Then we need to give him a taste of his own medicine." "What are you suggesting?" "That we find out exactly what happened to my father," she said firmly. "If Vickers was responsible, there must be evidence, and if we can prove it, we can stop him legally instead of just defending against his attacks." Pete looked doubtful. "That's dangerous territory, Miss Catherine." "More dangerous than waiting for him to destroy everything we have," she challenged. "Besides, I've been making inquiries. The stagecoach brings letters from my father's lawyer in Tucson tomorrow. Apparently, there's something important about the water rights that Vickers doesn't know." The next day, Catherine rode into town to meet the stagecoach, accompanied by one of the ranch hands for protection. As they tied their horses outside the general store, she noticed a group of Vickers men watching her from across the street. "Ignore them, Miss Catherine," her companion advised. "We'll get the mail and head straight back." But as Catherine collected her letters from the postmaster, a commotion erupted outside. She emerged to find Vickers himself confronting her ranch hand. "Miss Lambert," Vickers called, tipping his hat with mocking courtesy. "How fortunate to run into you. I was just about to ride out to make you another offer." "My answer hasn't changed, Mr. Vickers," Catherine replied coldly. Vickers stepped closer, lowering his voice. "You know, your father was stubborn too, right up until the end." Catherine felt a chill despite the desert heat. "What exactly do you mean by that?" "Just that accidents happen to stubborn people in these parts," Vickers said with a shrug. "Mines collapse, fires start, sometimes people even get shot by mistake during hunting season." His eyes flickered to the letters in her hand. "What have you got there, news from back east?" "My correspondence is none of your concern," Catherine replied, tucking the letters into her saddlebag. Vickers' pleasant facade slipped. "Everything in this territory is my concern, Miss Lambert. The sooner you understand that, the better off you'll be." As he turned to leave, he added casually, "By the way, I heard your well is starting to run dry. Be a shame if you had no water for those cattle of yours. My offer won't stay open forever." The ride back to the ranch was tense, Catherine's mind racing with Vickers' thinly veiled threats. But when she opened the lawyer's letter in the privacy of her father's study, her fear gave way to understanding. "Pete," she called excitedly, "I know why Vickers wants our land so badly." The foreman hurried in. "What is it?" Catherine spread a survey map across the desk. "According to my father's lawyer, our water rights extend far beyond what anyone realizes. Father commissioned a geological survey last year that shows the springs on our property are connected to an underground river system. If we control this land, we effectively control water access for half the county." Pete whistled low. No wonder Vickers is so determined. "And there's more," Catherine continued, scanning the letter. "Father was gathering evidence that Vickers has been illegally diverting water from other properties. He suspected corruption in the territorial offices that handle water rights registration. If your father was close to exposing this, it would give Vickers motive, Catherine finished grimly. We need to find that evidence. The letter says father kept detailed records in his private safe. They found the safe hidden behind a painting in the study. Inside were ledgers, maps, and sworn statements from farmers and small ranchers who had lost water access after Vickers moved into the territory. Most damning was a letter from a mine engineer stating that the section Catherine Lambert had been inspecting had been recently tampered with, the support beams strategically weakened. This is enough to take to the territorial marshal, Catherine said, her hands trembling with a mixture of grief and righteous anger. But before they could act, shots rang out from the direction of the main gate. Pete grabbed his rifle. Stay here and hide these documents, he ordered before rushing outside. Catherine quickly gathered the evidence into a satchel, then grabbed her father's revolver from the desk drawer. Through the window, she could see Vickers and at least a dozen men riding into the ranch yard, shooting at anything that moved. The few ranch hands were returning fire from whatever cover they could find, but they were badly outnumbered. Heart-pounding, Catherine realized Vickers must have guessed what the lawyer's letter contained. He was making his move now before they could take the evidence to the authorities. Her mind raced, trying to formulate a plan. She couldn't let her father's killers escape justice, couldn't let them steal the land he had died protecting. The sound of breaking glass made her whirl around. A burning torch had been thrown through the window on the opposite side of the house. Smoke began to fill the room as the dry wooden floors caught fire quickly. Catherine grabbed the satchel of documents and ran for the back door, only to find two of Vickers' men waiting. She ducked back inside, trapped between the advancing fire and the gunmen outside. The smoke was growing thicker, making it difficult to breathe or see. In desperation, she climbed out a side window and dropped to the ground, keeping low as she made her way toward the stables. If she could reach a horse, she might be able to escape to town with the evidence. The shooting continued around the main house, providing cover for her movements. She had just reached the stable door when a rough hand seized her arm. "Going somewhere, Miss Lambert?" Vickers himself stood there, his eyes cold with triumph. "I'll take those documents now." Catherine raised her father's revolver. "You killed him, you murdered my father." Vickers didn't deny it. Business is business. "Now be sensible. Drop the gun, give me those papers, and maybe I'll let you ride out of here alive." "Catherine, get down." The familiar voice came from behind Vickers, who spun in surprise. In that instant of distraction, Catherine wrenched free and dove to the ground. A shot rang out and Vickers staggered backward, clutching his shoulder. Standing 20 yards away, rifle raised, was Caleb Crawford. He looked different from when she'd last seen him, more tanned, his clothes trail-worn, stubble darkening his jaw. But his eyes were the same, steady and determined as he worked the lever action on his rifle, preparing for another shot if needed. "Crawford," Vickers spat, "you're supposed to be in Colorado." "Changed my plans," Caleb replied, moving closer, his rifle trained on Vickers. "Drop your gun." Vickers hesitated, then slowly lowered his weapon to the ground. In the distance, new shots could be heard, but these were coming from the direction of town. "Sounds like the marshal and his deputies finally arrived," Caleb observed. "I sent a telegram from the last trading post when I heard rumors about what was happening here." Catherine rose shakily to her feet, still clutching the satchel of evidence. "Caleb," she breathed, hardly believing he was really standing before her. "How did you know?" "Word travels even on the trail," he explained, his eyes never leaving Vickers. "Heard about trouble at the Lambert ranch. Decided the cattle drive could manage without me." The shooting gradually subsided as the marshal and his men overwhelmed Vickers' gunmen. Soon, the ranch yard was filled with deputies taking prisoners and assessing the damage. The house fire had been contained to one wing thanks to the quick action of some of the hands. The marshal, a grizzled veteran named Harding, examined the evidence Catherine provided. "This is enough to put Vickers away for a long time," he confirmed. "Murder, water theft, attempted murder. The territorial governor will be mighty interested in this case." As Vickers was led away in handcuffs, he fixed Caleb with a hateful glare. "You should have kept riding, Cowboy. This wasn't your fight." Caleb met his gaze steadily. "You're wrong about that." With the immediate danger past, Catherine finally had a moment to truly look at Caleb. "You left the cattle drive," she said, still processing this fact. "Why?" Caleb ran a hand through his hair, suddenly looking uncertain, a stark contrast to the confident man who had faced down Vickers moments before. "I couldn't stop thinking about what might be happening here, about you facing Vickers alone. But your job, your plans to keep moving. Some things matter more than plans," he said simply. Catherine felt tears welling in her eyes for the first time since hearing of her father's death. The emotions she had held at bay while fighting for the ranch, grief, fear, loneliness, all crashed over her at once. Without thinking, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around Caleb's waist, burying her face against his chest. After a moment's hesitation, his arms came around her, holding her gently as she finally allowed herself to break. "He's gone," she whispered. "My father's really gone, and I nearly lost everything else too." "But you didn't," Caleb reminded her, his voice rough with emotion. "You fought, you protected what was yours. That takes a kind of courage most men only pretend to have." She looked up at him, suddenly aware of how close they were. "Thank you for coming back." Something shifted in his expression, a softening, a vulnerability he'd kept hidden before. "I tried to convince myself I was better off alone, safer, but all those miles on the trail I kept thinking about this place, about you." Their moment was interrupted by Pete, who approached with news about the damage to the ranch and the condition of the injured hands. There would be time for personal conversations later. For now, there was work to be done. In the days that followed, the full story emerged. Vickers had indeed ordered the sabotage of the mine that killed Catherine Lambert. His scheme to monopolize water rights in the territory had been ongoing for years, aided by corrupt officials who were now also under investigation. With Vickers and his men in custody awaiting trial, the atmosphere in Rattlesnake Ridge changed perceptibly. Smaller ranchers and farmers who had been intimidated into silence began to speak out. Caleb stayed on at the Lambert Ranch, helping with repairs and rebuilding what had been damaged in the attack. He worked alongside the other hands, but everyone, including Catherine, noticed the way his eyes followed her, the way he always positioned himself nearby when strangers visited the ranch. A week after the showdown with Vickers, Catherine found Caleb alone on the porch after dinner, much as they had sat together the night before he left for the cattle drive. The desert evening was peaceful, stars emerging in the darkening sky. "Pete tells me the south pasture fence is finished," she said, joining him on the steps. Caleb nodded. "Should hold through the winter. We reinforced the weak spots." "We," Catherine repeated with a small smile. "You speak as if you're staying." He looked at her directly then, his expression open in a way it hadn't been when they first met. "Am I welcome to stay?" "You know you are," she said softly, "but I thought you preferred not to put down roots." "The frontier's no place for forming attachments, I believe you said." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. "I've been running for 3 years," he finally said, "telling myself I was being smart, being strong. But watching you fight for this place, for your father's legacy, made me realize something." "What's that?" "That there's more courage in staying than in running, more strength in caring about something or someone than in protecting yourself from loss." He reached out tentatively, taking her hand in his. "I'm tired of running, Catherine." The sound of her given name on his lips sent a warm current through her. "What are you saying, Caleb?" "I'm saying I'd like to stay, here at the Lambert Ranch." "With you," his voice grew more certain with each word. "I know it hasn't been long and there's still so much we don't know about each other, but I've never met anyone like you, someone who makes me want to stop running and start building something that lasts." Catherine felt her heart swell. Over the past weeks, through danger and rebuilding, her feelings for Caleb had grown from gratitude to admiration to something deeper she hadn't dared name. "The ranch needs a good foreman," she said, a teasing light in her eyes. "Pete's been talking about retiring." Caleb's smile faded slightly. "Is that all you see me as, a potential employee?" Catherine moved closer, her free hand reaching up to touch his cheek. "No," she whispered. "That's not all I see." The kiss that followed was gentle at first, then deepened with the release of feelings both had kept carefully guarded. When they finally parted, Caleb rested his forehead against hers, his breath uneven. "I never believed I could find this out here," he confessed, "something worth staying for." "Neither did I," Catherine replied. "After my father died, I thought I was alone in the world. That I'd have to fight every battle by myself." "Not anymore," Caleb promised, drawing her close again, "not if I have anything to say about it." The following spring, with the desert in rare bloom after winter rains, Caleb and Catherine were married beneath the cottonwood trees by the ranch's main spring. The ceremony was attended by everyone from Rattlesnake Ridge, along with ranchers and farmers from miles around who had benefited from the fall of Vickers and his corrupt allies. The Lambert Ranch flourished under their joint stewardship. Catherine's education and head for business complemented Caleb's practical knowledge of cattle and the land. Together, they established fair water-sharing agreements with neighboring properties, turning potential rivals into allies. News came that summer that Vickers had been convicted of murder and sentenced to hang. The corrupt officials who had aided him received long prison terms. Justice, delayed but not denied, brought a sense of closure to the territory. On the first anniversary of their meeting, Caleb took Catherine riding to a mesa overlooking the ranch. The afternoon sun bathed the desert in golden light, highlighting the green patches where their careful water management had allowed the land to flourish even in drought conditions. "Do you ever regret it?" Catherine asked as they gazed at the landscape spread before them, "giving up the freedom of the trail for all this responsibility?" Caleb looked at his wife, this remarkable woman who had challenged everything he thought he knew about himself and the frontier. "Freedom's a funny thing," he replied thoughtfully. "I thought it meant not being tied to anyone or anything, always being ready to move on." He reached for her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers, but that wasn't freedom. It was fear dressed up as independence. "And now," she prompted. Caleb smiled, the kind of unguarded smile that had once been rare but now came easily in Catherine's presence. "Now I know real freedom is choosing where to plant your roots, who to build your life with." He placed a gentle hand on her stomach where their first child was just beginning to show. "What legacy to leave behind?" As the sun began its descent toward the horizon, painting the desert in the same fiery hues that had backdropped their first meeting, Caleb and Catherine Crawford sat together on the mesa edge, no longer alone, no longer running, their future as vast and promising as the Arizona sky above them. In the harsh beauty of the desert, they had found what neither believed possible: a love strong enough to overcome the wounds of the past, to face down danger, and to build something lasting in a land where permanence was rare. And in finding each other, they had discovered the greatest frontier of all, the journey of two hearts learning to trust, to hope, and to love without reservation or fear.